I worked in a typical corporate office, one of those places where you could practically feel the clock ticking away your life. My boss, Dave, was the kind of guy who loved micromanaging every little thing. Whether it was emails, reports, or even the tone of voice we used in meetings, Dave had specific instructions for everything. It was exhausting, but hey, it was a job. One day, we got assigned a major project for a new client, and as usual, Dave had about 1,000,000 rules on how to handle it. I'd been there long enough to know that the best way to deal with Dave was just to follow his orders to the letter. No improvising, no shortcuts, just do what he says, even if it made no sense. So, when he handed me the project's guidelines, I made sure to read every single line carefully. I wasn't about to give him a reason to complain. But that's the thing about micromanagers, they don't need a reason to turn your life into a nightmare. This project would be the beginning of a crazy chain of events that I never saw coming. It turns out, following his instructions to the letter was exactly what would get me into trouble. Dave's instructions for the project were long, detailed, and borderline ridiculous. He had steps for everything: how to format emails, what fonts to use in the reports, and even when to send the client updates. He was paranoid about looking bad in front of upper management, so he made sure we followed his rules to the T. He sent the team an email with the subject line, "Do exactly as I say," in all caps, just in case we forgot who was in charge. I printed out his email and highlighted every point. If Dave wanted it done his way, fine, that's exactly what I was going to do. No creativity, no personal input, just strict compliance. Honestly, it seemed like a good way to avoid getting yelled at for doing something wrong. Dave had a habit of blaming everyone but himself when things went south, and I wasn't about to be his next target. For the first couple of days, everything went smoothly. I followed his instructions exactly and kept him updated like he wanted. But then, something weird happened. Upper management asked for changes to the project that directly contradicted Dave's rules. I was stuck between a rock and a hard place. Do I follow what upper management asked for? Or do I stick to Dave's crazy instructions? I decided to do what anyone would do when dealing with a micromanaging boss. I followed Dave's instructions to the letter. After all, he told us to do exactly as I say. Right? I wasn't about to go against that, no matter what upper management said. A few days into the project, things took a turn. Upper management called me into a meeting to discuss some concerns they had. They wanted changes to the project, big changes. The kind of changes that completely went against Dave's detailed instructions. They wanted a more modern design for the presentation, shorter reports, and direct communication with the client, instead of Dave's lengthy email chains. As I sat in that meeting, I knew I was in trouble. On one hand, these were high-level executives asking for changes. Ignoring them wasn't an option. On the other hand, Dave had drilled into us to follow his instructions, no exceptions. If I ignored his rules, I knew he'd flip out and blame me for going rogue. After the meeting, I sat at my desk, staring at my screen, trying to figure out what to do. I could either do what upper management wanted and deal with Dave's wrath, or follow Dave's exact instructions and risk upper management getting frustrated with the project's progress. I didn't want to be caught in the middle, but I knew Dave's obsessive micromanaging would come back to bite him. That's when I decided to take the safe route, for myself at least. I was going to stick to Dave's instructions to the letter. He wanted us to do exactly what he said? Fine. I'd follow his rules to a T, even if it meant the project started falling apart. After all, I was just doing what I was told. If something went wrong, it would all be on Dave. With my decision made, I dove back into the project and followed Dave's instructions to the letter. No shortcuts, no improvisations, no adjustments based on upper management's feedback. I kept everything just the way Dave wanted, down to the smallest detail. When upper management asked for updates, I'd politely tell them that we were following Dave's plan. And when they requested changes, I simply replied, "I'm sticking to the guidelines Dave provided." They'd raise an eyebrow, clearly frustrated, but I kept my cool. Dave had made it clear, his instructions were the law. So, I was going to let him own the entire process. Emails piled up from both sides. Management requesting changes, Dave sending his detailed updates, but I didn't flinch. I kept every communication transparent, showing Dave everything upper management wanted. His responses were always the same: stick to the plan. He believed his approach was flawless, and I wasn't about to question him. As the deadline for the project drew closer, the tension in the office started to rise. Management was getting annoyed that their feedback was being ignored, and Dave was growing more insistent that we continue on his path. I knew I was walking on a tightrope, but I didn't care anymore. I was following orders. If something blew up, it wouldn't be on me. The real question was, how long could this last before it all came crashing down? The final week before the deadline was a whirlwind. Management was sending daily emails, practically begging for updates. The pressure was mounting, and it felt like everyone in the office was holding their breath. But I stuck to the script, Dave's script. Every time management requested changes, I'd respond with, per Dave's instructions, we're following the original plan. It was becoming a mantra at this point. Meanwhile, Dave seemed oblivious to the growing tension. He'd walk around the office with that smug grin, acting like everything was under control. He even called a meeting to rally the troops and remind us how important it was to stay on course. The irony wasn't lost on me. We were heading straight for disaster, and Dave was steering the ship like a captain in denial. I watched as some of my coworkers shot me concerned looks. They knew things were going sideways, but no one wanted to be the one to challenge Dave. After all, he had the final say, and I wasn't about to risk my job by going rogue. So, I continued following his orders, fully aware that I was heading toward a collision with upper management. The day before the project's final presentation, I received an email from one of the higher-ups. We're concerned that the project isn't aligning with the company's vision. Is there any way to make last-minute changes? I forwarded the email to Dave and waited for his response. His reply was as predictable as ever. Stick to the plan. No changes. With that, I knew the bomb was about to go off. The morning of the big presentation arrived, and the tension in the office was palpable. I walked into the conference room with the team, and we set up the presentation as Dave strutted in like he owned the place. Upper management, CFO, COO, and a couple of other top executives sat at the long table, ready to review the project. I could feel their eyes on me, but I kept my cool. I was just the messenger, after all. The presentation started smoothly enough. Dave kicked it off, talking about the project's goals and how we'd stuck to the plan from day one. But as soon as I started going through the details, I could see the execs exchanging worried glances. About halfway through, the CFO interrupted. Wait, this isn't what we were expecting. Where are the adjustments we asked for? I swallowed, feeling the weight of the room shift. I explained, calmly, per Dave's instructions, we stayed on the original plan. He told us to avoid any last-minute changes. The room went silent. You could cut the tension with a knife. The COO leaned back, crossing his arms. Dave, we've been sending feedback for weeks. Why weren't those changes implemented? Dave's face went red. He fumbled for a second before trying to spin it. I didn't think the changes were necessary. I wanted to keep the team focused on the initial vision. It was clear they weren't buying it. The CFO's eyes narrowed. We expect our managers to follow directives, especially when they come from us. I sat back, trying to blend into the chair, knowing that the real fallout was just beginning. Part 7. The blame game begins. As the meeting continued, Dave's demeanor shifted from confident to visibly shaken. He tried to redirect the conversation, attempting to justify his decision to stick to the original plan. But the execs weren't having it. The CFO spoke up again, cutting him off. Dave, this isn't just a simple oversight. We sent you clear instructions to make adjustments. Are you telling us you ignored them? Dave stammered, trying to defend himself, but it was obvious he was grasping at straws. Then, without warning, he turned to me and pointed his finger. Well, it wasn't just me. Jake here is the project lead and he handled all the details. If there was a misunderstanding, it's on him too. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The guy who had micromanaged every single step of this project was now trying to throw me under the bus. I felt a flash of anger, but I stayed calm. I looked at the execs and said, with all due respect, I followed Dave's direct instructions. Every decision made was signed off by him. I was told explicitly not to deviate from the original plan, even after receiving feedback. The room fell silent again. The COO leaned forward, glaring at Dave. Is that true, Dave? Did you override our feedback? Dave stuttered again. Well, I thought it was the best course of action at the time. The CFO leaned back, folding his arms, clearly frustrated. That's not your call to make. This is a serious issue, and there will be consequences. At that moment, I knew Dave had messed up big time, and no matter how hard he tried to deflect the blame, it wasn't going to work. After the meeting ended, I returned to my desk, my mind racing. Dave had tried to pin the blame on me, but it backfired. The execs weren't buying it, and I could see the writing on the wall for him. But that didn't mean I was out of the woods yet. I knew things were going to get tense. Not even an hour later, Dave called me into his office. I could tell he was rattled, but he was trying to keep up appearances. Jake, he started. That meeting didn't go well, but we need to move forward. I want you to redo the project with the revisions they asked for. I blinked. After all that, he was still trying to boss me around like nothing had happened. Dave, with all due respect, they already gave us clear instructions weeks ago. If you had allowed me to follow them then, we wouldn't be in this mess. His face darkened. Watch your tone, Jake. This is a team, and I expect you to follow my lead. At that point, I had enough. I stood up, looked him dead in the eye and said, Dave, I followed your lead, and now look where we are. You ignored the higher-ups, threw me under the bus, and now you want me to clean up your mess? I don't think so. He stared at me, speechless for a moment, before leaning back in his chair. You're walking a fine line, Jake. I didn't flinch. I think you should be more worried about yourself. Without saying another word, I walked out of his office, knowing this confrontation wasn't over yet. Dave wasn't the type to take a blow like that lightly, and I had no idea what he'd try next. But whatever it was, I was ready. The next day, I noticed something strange. Dave was acting unusually nice to me, almost too nice. He kept asking if I needed anything, if I was comfortable, and even offered to help me with my tasks. It felt like he was trying to soften me up after our confrontation. But I wasn't fooled. This was Dave's way of manipulating me back into his control. At first, I played along. I didn't want to make any waves, especially after the fallout from the meeting. But I started noticing little things. Small tasks being assigned to me that were completely outside of my job description. Things that were either irrelevant or already covered. Dave was trying to set me up to fail. If I didn't complete them in time, he'd have another excuse to blame me. T was the next morning when Dave dropped the bombshell. He called me into his office with that same smile plastered on his face. Jake, I've got another project for you, he said, handing me a list of tasks that were completely absurd. There were deadlines that were impossible to meet and projects that weren't even part of my job. He said, This is crucial for the department. We really need you to take care of it, and I know you can handle it. I looked at the list, shaking my head. I knew what he was doing. This wasn't an assignment, this was a setup. He wanted me to fail, but I had a plan. If I followed his instructions to the letter, there was no way he could blame me if things went south. If I did everything as he asked, exactly how he asked, he'd have no excuse to fire me. That's when I had an idea. I took a moment to compose myself and responded calmly, Sure, I'll get right on it. No problem. The rest of the day went by, and I worked on the ridiculous tasks he gave me. I followed every order down to the tiniest detail. Each report was formatted in the exact way he described, even though it made no sense. The emails I sent were word for word what he had asked for. The reports were padded with irrelevant information just to hit the word count he wanted. It was exactly what he'd been pushing me to do. By the time I was finished, the work I turned in was a mess. Each task completed as per his impossible instructions. I knew this would come back to haunt him. When I handed it in, I could see Dave's face change. He looked at the pile of work and just stood there, stunned. I gave him a smile and left his office. The next morning, Dave called me in again. But this time, he wasn't smiling. He looked frustrated and confused. He started going over my work, pointing out everything that was wrong, even though it was all exactly what he had asked for. "Jake, this is not what I meant. This is a disaster," he said. I simply responded, "I followed your instructions, Dave. You asked for it this way." His face turned red, and he didn't know what to say. He couldn't blame me for something he had told me to do. He was stuck, and in that moment I knew I had won. Little did I know, this was the beginning of the final showdown. It didn't take long for Dave to call me into his office again. The tension in the air was thick, and the minute I walked through the door, I could feel something was different. Dave was sitting behind his desk, looking more agitated than ever. He barely looked up from the papers in front of him when he spoke. "Jake, we need to talk," he said, his voice tense. "This situation is getting out of hand. I'm not happy with the way things are going, and frankly, you're not meeting expectations." I sat there, pretending to be confused. "But Dave, I did exactly what you asked for. I followed your instructions down to the last detail. If there's something wrong with the work, maybe you should clarify what you really wanted." He slammed his hand on the desk, which made me jump slightly. "This is ridiculous. This is not what I meant. You can't be serious." I leaned forward, keeping my voice steady. "But you were very clear. You said you wanted it this way, and I did it. I'm just following your instructions, Dave." He was seething now, his face bright red. "I didn't mean for you to screw everything up on purpose. I just needed you to get it done right." I raised my eyebrows and calmly replied, "But you didn't give me clear instructions. You didn't give me a realistic deadline. You gave me an impossible task and expected everything to work out. I did what you asked, and now you're blaming me for it. You can't have it both ways." There was a long, uncomfortable silence as Dave fumed, trying to figure out how to spin this into my fault. The truth was, he had put me in a no-win situation, and I had simply followed the rules he'd set out for me. Finally, Dave sighed deeply, defeated. "You're right, Jake. This isn't working anymore. I'm going to have to let you go." I didn't even flinch. I stood up, shook my head, and said, "I figured this was coming. But let me remind you, you're the one who made this mess. You told me what to do, and now you're firing me for doing it." He didn't answer, and as I walked out of his office for the last time, I felt a strange sense of relief. I had done what was right, even if it meant losing my job. But little did Dave know, this was far from the end of this story. As I left the building, I couldn't help but smile. I had just outsmarted the guy who thought he was in control, and that felt pretty damn good. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. After being fired, I didn't know what to expect. Part of me was worried, unsure about how I'd pay the bills, but the other part of me, surprisingly, felt free. I had taken a stand against an unfair situation, and I wasn't going to let it break me. I spent the first few days updating my resume and sending it out to different companies. But something unexpected happened. I started getting calls, not from companies I applied to, but from some of my old colleagues who had heard about the situation. Apparently, the story of me being fired for doing exactly what my boss asked had spread like wildfire throughout the industry. People were impressed by my ability to follow the instructions to the letter and then still stand up for myself when things went sideways. One colleague, Mike, called me and said, "Jake, man, I heard what happened. I gotta say, it's ballsy what you did. Most people would have just caved." "Yeah," I replied. "Well, I figured I had nothing to lose. I did my part. If he couldn't manage his own expectations, that's on him." Mike laughed. "You know, we need someone like you over at my company. I'll put in a good word for you." I didn't know if anything would come of it, but it felt good knowing people respected me for standing up for what was right. The real kicker came a week later when I got a call from the HR department at my old company. They told me that Dave had been restructured out of his position. Apparently, word of his poor management and lack of clarity had caught up with him. In an ironic twist, the company had decided to let him go, after firing me for the exact same reason. I couldn't help but laugh. Dave had made the mistake of not realizing that the buck doesn't stop with the employee when the instructions come from the top. People started reaching out to me with job offers, wanting to know if I was interested in joining their teams. It was surreal. It was like the world had finally realized I was right the whole time. I had gone from being fired to being in demand, and all it took was one simple thing: standing firm on the truth. In the end, the situation taught me more than I expected. Sometimes things fall apart, but when you're doing what's right, you can pick up the pieces and turn it all into something even better. I walked away from a job I hated and stepped into something new and exciting. I had learned that sometimes you don't need to please everyone, just yourself. And that, in the end, made all the difference. It had been a month since the firing, and life was starting to fall into place. I had landed a new job with a better title, better pay, and a company that actually appreciated my work. Things were looking up, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I was on the right track. But then, out of nowhere, I got an email from my old company. It was from HR, and they asked me to meet with them. I was confused. Why would they want to talk to me again? Was it about my unemployment claim? Or were they going to beg me to come back? I honestly didn't know what to expect. I set up the meeting, and a few days later, I walked into the HR office. To my surprise, they weren't offering an apology or asking me to return. Instead, they handed me a check, an unexpected severance package. Apparently, the company had been hit with some legal issues regarding wrongful termination claims from previous employees. They were offering settlements to those they'd wronged. I had never expected anything like this. I had just assumed the situation was over and done with. But here they were, practically admitting that they'd made a mistake firing me. The check was substantial, and it came with a non-disclosure agreement, preventing me from talking about the settlement publicly. Felt like a strange kind of victory. The company had clearly recognized their mistake. They had offered a settlement to avoid further legal issues, and to top it off, they were indirectly acknowledging that they had wronged me. But honestly, I didn't care about the money. What mattered was that I'd been vindicated. The firing had turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. On top of that, I got a call from my new boss, Karen, who had heard about the settlement. "Jake, I just want to say I'm really glad you're with us now. I don't know the details, but I heard how things went down. You're exactly the kind of person we need here. Someone who knows how to stand up for themselves and do the right thing." It felt good to be appreciated, to know that all the chaos had led to something positive. That check was nice, but the real reward was the respect I was getting. It was a sweet reminder that sometimes the hardest paths lead to the best destinations. Little did I know, this wasn't the last I would hear from my old company. Just when I thought everything was behind me, the phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I answered anyway. On the other end was a familiar voice, my old boss, Dan. I hadn't heard from him in weeks, and hearing his voice again was like a flashback to the stress and frustration I had left behind. "Jake, hey," Dan said, his tone strangely apologetic. "I know things ended badly, but I wanted to reach out. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I realized I made a huge mistake. The whole firing thing? It wasn't just bad for you, it was bad for the company too. I'm sorry, man." At first, I wasn't sure how to respond. This was the same guy who fired me for following his own instructions. The same guy who hadn't shown a shred of empathy when he handed me my walking papers. Now he was calling, asking for forgiveness. It was hard to take him seriously after everything that had gone down. But then he hit me with a curveball. "Jake, I've been talking to HR, and they've come to an agreement to offer you a new position at the company. We've realized we need people like you. People who can think for themselves and stand up for what's right. We made a mistake and we want to make it right. We're offering you a promotion and a raise. We're sorry for how we treated you." For a moment, I just sat there in stunned silence. Was he really offering me a chance to come back? After everything? The firing, the stress, the lawsuit? Couldn't believe it. "Dan," I finally said, trying to keep my cool, "I've moved on. I'm doing better now. I've got a good job, and I'm not looking back." There was a pause on the other end, and I could practically hear Dan shifting uncomfortably. "I understand, Jake. But if you change your mind, we'll be here. We know we messed up, and we'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust back." I hung up, feeling a mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to take the offer, to show them that they needed me more than I needed them. I landed a new job at a better company, with a boss who actually respects their employees. Following orders may have gotten me fired, but standing up to a control freak like Dave was worth it. Sometimes, malicious compliance is the best kind of revenge.